Good day, grade 12. Today's lesson is based on Black consciousness with the subtopic of the South African student movement. This lesson will discuss the following key ideas: the reasons for the formation of the South African student movement, the role of the South African student movement in the 1976 Soweto Uprising, and a reflection on this tragic event and its significance to the Black consciousness movement and South Africa's history. Let us look at the key words for this lesson. The first key word today is the BCM. The BCM is abbreviated for the Black Consciousness Movement. The Black Consciousness Movement was the realization by the Black man of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their oppression, the blackness of their skin, and to operate as a group to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. Nationalism. Nationalism was the identification with one's nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. This correlated to the ideologies of Steve Biko through Black consciousness, which stood for the empowerment of the Black South Africans through self-worth and awareness, aiding eventual self-governance. Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community. Bantu education. Bantu education was an act which was aimed at training the children of, for manual labor and menial jobs that the government deemed suitable for those of their race, and it was explicitly intended to inculcate the idea that black people were to accept being subservient to white South Africans. SASO, also known as the South African Student Organization, was an organization launched by university students on segregated campuses of so-called non-whites. It created an organizational space for black students. Let us look at the differences between SASO and SASM. SASO, the South African Student Organization, was formed by Steve Biko in the black universities to serve the political interests of black students. This organization would grow on to become a mother organization for other organized group activities in black communities that reinforced the teachings of black consciousness. The South African Student Movement was a black conscious organization for high school students, an umbrella body under the South African Student Movement, which consisted of various other organizations with a common interest in spreading black consciousness. So, SASO was the mother organization. SASO opened doors for other organizations to form, hence the formation of the South African Student Movement. The South African Student Movement was independent on its own because it only protected the interests of high school students, yet SASO, as a main body, enforced organizations of various backgrounds, whether it be workers, women's organizations, or student organizations. Let us recap on what in essence the Black consciousness is. So, what do we already know about the Black consciousness movement? The Black consciousness movement was led by Bantu Stephen Biko, who was born in 1946 and died in 1977. The movement held socialist and nationalist ideologies that advocated for black self-awareness, education in black communities, and unity amongst black professionals and intellectuals through SASO, which was resistance through political action. The movement enforced unity between community members and workers through organized activities that celebrated black cultural identities, historical figures, and the re-establishment of trade unions. An example of this is how Black practitioners encouraged cultural and ethnic practice amongst Black South Africans by hosting events that celebrated cultural diversities in Black communities. These involved festivals that looked at the Zulu or Xhosa or Sotho or Tswana ethnic groups. Another example can be how historical figures were celebrated. These were figures that were in exile or in prison, such as Nelson Mandela or Walter Sisulu, and they were celebrated in communities. Another thing would be the re-establishment of trade unions where workers grouped together and to form one whole and to establish trade unions even though they were still banned in South Africa at that time. The 1960s were a very difficult period for Black South Africans, yet quite prosperous for the apartheid. What does this mean? In 1960, the Sharpeville massacre saw the arrest of dozens of anti-apartheid activists, right? And the apartheid government had no form of opposition for over 10 years between 1960 and 1970, which means black people's spirits were defeated because their leaders were imprisoned or in exile, while the apartheid government enjoyed the prospects of having no form of opposition and having a very strong police force that was active at that time. This new ideology of black consciousness and way of life was aimed at building the spirits of a defeated black community by reminding them of their significance. Steve Biko encouraged black South Africans to accept the Bantu education that was given. The fight was no longer physical, yet psychological. In other words, black people were encouraged to fight with a pen instead of a sword. This is through using education, using knowledge to build yourself mentally, to understand your history, your origin, your struggles, so that you can move on to lead your own people. Steve Biko that believed that black people were not ready to lead themselves until they had pride and confidence within themselves. And this pride and confidence could only be found through embracing the elements of education.
Decade 12. So now we'll continue on the formation of the South African student movement. For example, how was it formed and what were the reason for it to be formed? I have questions for you. You can take a pen and piece of paper and write your answers down. Firstly, I'll have to ask you guys, which is, does your school have a student representative council? For example, prefects, ICLs, head boys, or head girls. And also, why will this be considered important? And also, do you think that young people like yourselves deserve to have a say on the issues faced in your communities? What kind of issues? For example, poverty, teenage pregnancy, and all that you can think of. I hope you learners have written down your answers. Now we'll get to the reasons for the formation of the South African student movement. South African student movement was formed in 1964, was an organization that represented high school students from marginalized communities, mainly in Soweto. Learners were given the platform to articulate their school and community-based grievances and foster contact between students at various schools regionally and nationally. The South African student movement focused on three issues. They wanted schools to have student representative councils so that they can represent their interests and present their grievances. They wanted summer and winter schools to help students prepare for matric exams. And they wanted to limit compulsory student involvement in annual inter-school music competitions, which took time away from preparations for exams. It came to a national convenience when its members organized the boycott against Bantu education, and especially against the enforcement of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, which resulted in the June 16 uprising. Now we'll get to the socio-economic conditions of the 1970s. In the 1970s, rural urbanization increased as many black South Africans left their homelands in search for better jobs. Most people moved to Johannesburg, with the city facing shortages in housing and rent increases. Shacks had no waste management or electrical supplies. They were built as a response to housing demand in townships. People lived in overcrowded conditions with few facilities. The downturn of the South African economy in 1973 caused massive inflation together with a huge unemployment rate. Most school leavers faced the prospect of unemployment.
So now we move to the educational conditions of the 1970s. The main cause of the educational poverty in black schools was the Bank Education Act of 1963. The apartheid government of National Party, which is the NP, put little funds into the education of the black students. More funds were pumped into the education of the white scholars. There was a shortage of classrooms, learners were overcrowded, and teaching and learning was not effectively conducted. Many teachers were underqualified and exercised brutal discipline to control class that sometimes hurt prevent learners in interest. There was also shortage of teaching aids like textbooks, libraries, and science laboratories. Some of you here might be living with grandparents or with community members who were there during apartheid, and they have told you what is happening during apartheid here, and that means you have some knowledge of what I am talking about. The role of the South African student movement in the 1976 Soweto Uprising. The South African student movement is abbreviated as the SASM. The introduction of Afrikaans as the medium language of learning and teaching. Between 1974 to 1976, the apartheid government has passed a decree that all subjects in schools will be taught in Afrikaans. That was the last straw, and the end of the youth exploded. This sparked outrage among South Africa's black youth and would build up to the strongest social resistance against the apartheid government in history. The South African student movement, which is the SASM, called a meeting on the 13th of June 1976. The meeting was held at Maurice Isaacson High. The ringleaders of this meeting was Theodore Mashinini, who was the chairperson, and Seth Masibuko, who was the secretary. In this meeting, they were discussing the problems that they were faced with, such as economic hardships under which they live, terrible conditions in school, and the introduction of Afrikaans as the medium of instruction. They agreed to the formation of the Soweto Student Representative Council, which is the SSRC. Theatre Mashinini was the president of the SSRC. They agreed that June 16 would be the day of protest action. They also agreed that all students of Soweto will wear uniforms as usual and assembly at Orlando Stadium in Orlando East. The meeting was held secretly, but the police managed to get information on its commitments. So Soweto students fought for their freedom, quality education, better living conditions, and they also fought against the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. In today's age, some of you might be multilingual and would employ themselves to fight against the use of other language. But you can also fight for your rights, um, quality education, and better conditions in schools. You can do that by engaging in protest or sit-ins. Okay, now we are going to talk about the tragic outcomes of 1976 and its significance for South Africa's history. When we are talking about the outcome of 1976, we are looking at our event June 16, our Soweto Uprising. Okay, now let's watch a short video which is based on the events of 2016.
Soweto under fire. The country's largest township had a dark cloud hovering over it. June 16. Soweto under fire. The country's largest township had a dark cloud hovering over it. June 16, 1976, presented a new form of resistance towards the Afrikaans language policy introduced under the Bantu education in 1953 under the then apartheid government. It was under Bantu education that the then apartheid government spent 644 rands on a white child's education as opposed to a mere 42 rands on a black child's education. It was such inequalities, coupled with the Afrikaans language being enforced on black students, that led to a revolt. On that fateful day of June the 16th, what was supposed to be a peaceful protest by black students against the Afrikaans language policy turned ugly. Police fired at thousands of protesting students, killing 176 of them and leaving thousands injured.
That was a short video which was showing us the events which happened on 2016. So basically in this video we can see that there are different students from different schools which gathered in Soweto on the 16th of June. So they gathered to protest against the freedom of especially the Africans as they were forced to study non-language subjects like mathematics under Africans. So they gathered to protest under the medium of instruction. So police came in armored cars and then they started shooting the students, whereby about 176 of them died and thousands of them were left injured. The realization of the protest against by the South African police arms was met with a huge response. So on the 16th of June 1976, the police and students came to face with each other for the first time on Vilakazi Street opposite Orlando West High School. It was around 10:30 on the morning of June 16, 1976. Around 6,000 pupils in school uniforms stand, shouted, and waved placards bearing slogans such as "Away with Africans," "Afrikaans is the language of the oppressors," and "We are third victims of ignorance with Afrikaans is a poisonous food." Their weapons were the stones that lay on the ground before them. So they were using stones against the police. The police fired on the scene as they were trying to stop them from protesting. Dozens of South African students were injured with the prominent death of Hector Peterson, a 13-year-old boy who was caught in the crossfire. Thousands of children were driven by the anger and resentment towards a system that was purposely constructed to marginalize them. They came out in their thousands to march against the injustices that not only took place in their schools but also in their community. The Soweto Uprising would mark the beginning of the end of apartheid in South Africa. So, I'd like you to take your piece of papers and pens and answer the following questions on this significant historical event and its relevance to today's society as a national holiday. So firstly, I would like, when you get home, I know you have elders in your homes and in your community. So it can be anyone, whether a family member, a guardian, or a community leader. Conduct an interview in which you record their response on their recollection and understanding of the existing events. So you have to go to someone who's an elder and interview that person regarding the events that happened on the 16th of June in 1976. Secondly, do you think the youth of South Africa understand the significance of the national holiday of June 16? Think of how you, a young student, choose to celebrate this holiday. So you have to write down how you, as a young student, choose to celebrate this holiday, and how do you understand this holiday. I think you usually see how other people are usually celebrate this day. So now, how do you choose to celebrate this day, as a young student. And lastly, look at the socio-economic health of your own community. This could be poverty, crime, unemployment, teenage pregnancy, and so on. How do these issues affect the quality of your education? So you'll have to look more into how poverty, crime, unemployment, teenage pregnancy, and so on, and how does this affect the quality of your education. So for example, most teenagers when they are pregnant, they stop going to school, and sometimes some after even giving birth they no longer go back to school. So this affects one quality of education. Let us look at the following examples. Do any of you remember the Fees Must Fall movement of 2014? You may have heard stories of university students fighting against the increase in university fees and how some students are marginalized due to their lack of funds to go to university. So you as a grade 12 student, how would you feel if there was no national financial aid and assistance provided by the government for school giving students that come from under-resourced schools or disadvantaged backgrounds? You see how you as young people can stand firmly together to fight for your futures and stand up against discriminatory laws that segregate the society. Think about the things that negatively affect your community. How can you as a young person play a role in ensuring that your communities develop beyond what they are today? Alright guys, let us look at more examples to help us see the connections between historical events and modern events that are happening today, right? Let us look at the current conditions in your school. Are your classrooms overcrowded? Meaning that do they have 40 or more learners in one classroom? Do you guys have enough books, tables, desks, qualified teachers, or recreational sports facilities in your school? Do you guys have a soccer field? Do you have a netball field or a netball court? Do you guys have enough tables in your classrooms? Do you guys have enough chairs in your classrooms? Hmm? Think about these. Do you guys have scientific labs or computer labs in your schools? Does your school have a feeding scheme to assist learners that come from households that do not have enough food or money to buy food? How common is it for learners to drop out or fall pregnant in your school? And if it is common in your school, how common is it for learners to come back and decide to learn again in school even after they have given birth? If your school faces most or all of these issues, how do you think the government should be held accountable? Remember, today we live in a democratically led government. So how should our government that is now in a democracy be held accountable in comparison to how the apartheid government justified its actions of implementing harsh acts that segregated people and limited the abilities and the opportunities that people had? Lastly, how do the issues in your community and school relate to the issues faced by the learners in 1976? I can give you a head start with how our schools today may relate to the issues faced in 1976. We still face overcrowding in schools, especially schools that are based in rural areas or townships that have marginalized groups of people, such as black students, right? We also know that we still have schools that do not have enough resources, such as books and reading material and facilities, exactly as to how the same issues that people in 1976 faced during that period of time. So think about all of these questions and write down these questions in your books and use these questions to compare the events of 1976 and the events that are taking place today. Look at the connections between these events. How are these events connected to one another? How is history building over time? How do we see history coming into life in our schools, in our societies, in our communities? How is it different? How are things different now than the way they were back in the day? We no longer live under apartheid, we live under a democracy. That can be one difference. We also know that our government does provide social assistance to all groups in South Africa which are below the poverty line or feel as though they are marginalized. And this was different than in the 1970s. So look at the similarities and differences in events that took place or led up to June 16 and look at how these events shape our society and shape the way we think and we feel about certain things that are happening today. As a country, we still have a long way to go. Look at the first picture. The first picture depicts groups of learners who are sitting in a classroom or rather standing in a classroom. The classroom is nice and spacious with pictures on the wall and it looks like it has a fairly good construction structure. Look at the second picture. The second picture depicts learners who are sitting in a classroom that does not seem entirely hygienic. The board seems to be dysfunctional and the learners seem to be learning under difficult conditions. Look at the difference between these two pictures. This is South Africa today. In today's society, we still have learners who come from under-resourced schools and do not have enough in comparison to other learners who are now better off. We as a country need to ensure that we work towards building society so that we all live in an equal and fair society. The apartheid government had introduced harsh and scrutinizing laws that segregated people. Today, we see the legacy of this segregation within our schools. The youth of 1976 fought hard and well to ensure that South Africa could one day become a state that was inclusive through its educational practices. Yes, we are starting to see the blended approach in opportunities that are available to certain types of learners, but we also notice that some children are still living under the difficult conditions which have soared for over the 40 years of apartheid. Our job as society is to ensure that we work towards building a new South Africa by reflecting on our past, looking at our mistakes of the past, and taking those mistakes into account into working towards a better future for everyone in our country. I'd like to thank you for spending time with us in this lesson, and we hope that you have enjoyed our lesson. Thank you.